the 22nd of July, 1944. 2:10 hours. A blackout curtain draped the Navy quay at Yokosuka like a theatre scrim, and behind it the crane's hook descended with the hesitant grace of a surgeon's hand. The mass that rose from the barge was not elegant. It had the square-shouldered posture of a dockworker and the scabbed paint of something that had already lived a life. Bowed glacis, squat turret, track shoes studded with coral, an American M4, pieced together from two carcasses that the sea had failed to digest. Naval divers' hair plastered, ribs laddered by the night chill guided the pendulum of steel with palmed guy lines. Someone hissed, "Sherman," and the word moved down the pier in a ripple that sounded like superstition learning to spell. Major engineering. Matsuda Keiji tasted the smell before the shape resolved. Warm gear oil under salt, preservative wax, a sweet ghost of gasoline trapped in seams. By training, he expected bluntness, overweight armor, coarse threads, what he privately called the loudness of American industry. Instead, as hooded lanterns walked their small moons across the hull, he saw something worse for pride, a machine that wanted to be understood. This was a composite animal. The lower hull and one set of bogies had come from a U.S. Marine tank stranded on a reef and abandoned under fire. The turret shell and a spare road wheel had been dragged from a lagoon whose sand still glittered in the track links. The twin-diesel power-pack GM 6046 sat on a separate pallet like a heart waiting for a chest. The Navy had promised a single tank. What they delivered was better, a syllabus. Lieutenant Sakurai Nobuhiko, all wire and angles at 30, slipped a hand along the fender, felt a row of tiny domes under his fingertips, and laughed once, quietly, as if a riddle had revealed its joke. Grease nipples zerks everywhere, each with a little arrow cast or stamped to tell a tired hand here. Road wheel carriers, return roller arms, idler adjusters, the constellation repeated until the mind stopped resisting and accepted the pattern. He thumbed a coupler. The spring inside centered itself with the self-respect of good steel. Interchangeable, he said, and meant the fittings, the logic, and the doctrine that must sit behind both. The crane set the tank on timber balks with a thud that rang through the pier. Tools moved in their own, and what the Navy had salvaged with the wrecks, a U.S. wrench roll wrapped in oiled cloth, an air cleaner as big as a rice tub, a packet of diagrams sealed in waxed paper and stamped with an ordnance number. Matsuda cracked a stowage bin. The gasket did not tear. It was not a strip hand-cut by a private with a razor. It was a moulded ring that intended to come off whole and go back on again. Even the small mercy of a cover that forgives haste tugged at him like homesickness. They laid hands on the running gear first. A bogie truck, vertical volute spring suspension, two fat coils hugging a rocking arm came off after Matsuda conscripted 6 sailors and a jack that had already seen 10 wars. 2 men on a breaker bar, one with a pry, and the assembly slid free like a drawer in a well-built chest. Bearing caps wore stamped numbers that matched their mates. Road wheel hubs opened without requiring a prayer. Bronze bushings gleamed. Seals were double-lipped, the outer lip for the world, the inner for the fool. Overbuild, Sakurai murmured, pinching a coil with calipers. Overbuild because someone has under-maintenance in mind. He measured a hub. The numbers refused metric obedience. Inch. The thought did not annoy him so much as it clarified the enemy's confidence. Choose a standard, never deviate. Force the man with the wrong wrench to become the man with the right one by issuing him the right one everywhere. Under the belly, inspection covers held by identical bolts, the same hex across a dozen assemblies. Inside the covers, wiring looms wore rubber boots, lashed in with waxed string, routed behind stamped tabs that kept a clumsy hand from making new problems. On one plate, raised letters drain with an arrow to salvation. Matsuda's memory produced a parade of nights spent explaining to conscripts which plug was which. Here the machine itself had carved the lesson in steel. The humility of it cut deeper than any boast. They wrestled the air cleaner onto a bench. It was an oil bath cyclone built to inhale a beach. Sakurai unfolded the element and went quiet in the way men do when arithmetic robs them of an illusion. The effective surface area dwarfed the Type 97's. He pictured Saipan's coral dust lifting on every tread, pouring toward the lungs of an engine. The Americans had answered with excess capacity, surface area like a sail, a bowl that allowed gravity to do the boring work of separating grit before men and parts had to suffer it. They designed for dirty war, he said, and it sounded like a diagnosis. A diver produced a small trophy, a pitted plate stamped R975 from a radial Sherman raised farther out, a cousin's name tag. They would not see that engine tonight, but its philosophy already haunted the hull in front of them: mass, forgiveness, breath. Beside it, crated like contraband, the twinned Detroit diesels of the 6046 peered through canvas. The coupling flange looked too large until you remembered torsion, pulses, warmth, and the hammer rhythm of a hurried shift. They plan the quarrel, Sakurai said, tapping the damper, and give the marriage a cushion. Deep wading fittings hid their sea secrets in plain sight: blanked ports, flange rings, a logic of trunks and seals that could be bolted on in an afternoon to make a land animal breathe surf. Periscope housings locked down with a single lever a blind hand could find. Pedals wore non-skid faces cast in, not applied, cast. The driver's seat slid on bronze, not paint over paint. None of it was beautiful. All of it was gentle to the man who would be asked to live under it. They pried up an ammunition rack and stared into a rectangular tub lined with thin plate. The saltwater sheen still clung. Wet stowage, Sakurai said, and the rumor that had travelled back from the Marianas their tanks don't burn abandoned rumor's vagueness and found a home as measurable as 3 fingers of water. Fire was a maintenance problem too, if you were arrogant enough to design it so. At a crate's bottom, oiled paper cracked like pastry. A parts list stared back in silhouettes and arrows: fan belt, water pump, gasket set, track jack. Torque numbers sat in bold for eyes half asleep. No cursive, no artistry. The illustrations did not flatter the reader. They did not need to. The book and the machine were conspiring to abolish excuses. The bogies went back on with the same lack of ceremony with which they had come off. 2 men lifted, 2 men aligned, pins slid, hammers thunked. The return roller cap had a shallow lip, a knife could catch if a puller was lost. The idler adjuster's thread looked as if it had eaten a smaller thread for breakfast. Everywhere the same argument repeated. Make the failure gentle, make the correction cheap, make the ritual obvious. Do not ask a 19-year-old to be a virtuoso in a downpour. On the glacis plate, a word embossed in the foundry lift caught lantern light. Matsuda put his hand to the casting and felt that the steel did not pretend to invulnerability. It wanted to deform, to mushroom when struck. A cracked plate kills a schedule. A dented plate is a story you tell while you wait for fuel. Sensei, Sakurai said, grease up to his wrist, voice soft with a tired man's respect. It isn't that it never breaks down. Matsuda looked along the row of identical bolts he could touch without looking. No, he said. It is that when it does, the tank conspires with its keeper to make the break small and the return quick. He watched a sailor work the zerk gun, hand falling naturally from fitting to fitting in a path the designers had drawn for him in steel. Reliability by route, logistics writ into castings. A breeze came off the bay and salted their lips. Somewhere out in the black water a ship rolled and sighed. The crane hook rattled, eager for another chore. The men on the pier were past heroics now. They were inside the work. Matsuda flipped open his notebook and underlined a phrase until the pencil dulled. Not designed to impress. Designed to keep moving. He had loved craftsmanship all his life, the single piece done perfectly. The fit you could feel with your eyes closed. Under the hooded lanterns, among gasketed hatches and grease points wearing their own grammar, he felt the gravity of another love pull at him, a machine humble enough to be maintained by imperfect men, and proud enough to admit that this was how wars were won. By dawn, Yokosuka's sky was the color of gunmetal and steam. The naval crane had gone silent, leaving the Sherman sitting under canvas tarps that flapped like flags without nations. Inside, warehouse No. 6, Where the Army Technical Bureau had claimed a corner for its study, the air smelled of diesel, salt, and graphite. A detail of soldiers rolled the American hull onto timber blocks, while Major Matsuda and Lieutenant Sakurai prepared the dissection table, a broad plank, not for organs, but for ideas. They had unbolted the first engine cover before breakfast. Beneath it, order revealed itself again. Every hose wore a clamp stamped with its size. Every cable terminated in a numbered tag. The Americans, it seemed, had made even electricity obedient. Sakurai's hand traced a loom leading to the starter solenoid. "It is idiot-proof," he muttered, half in awe, half in accusation. "A peasant could repair this." Matsuda smiled thinly. "That is the point, Lieutenant. In America, even the peasant is a mechanic by design." They had read captured manuals from the Philippines, thick, illustrated field guides for everything from rifles to jeeps, but the reality before them was more unsettling. The Sherman's design assumed human error and forgave it. The Japanese Type 97, for all its clever weight-saving and craftsmanship, demanded delicacy. Its steering clutch burned if misaligned, its cooling system begged for clean water. This tank, by contrast, was a brute that thrived on neglect. It was not a samurai's blade, it was a farm tool that refused to die. They stripped the cooling assembly next, twin fans, belt-driven, guarded by shrouds that directed air with mathematical efficiency. The radiators themselves were overbuilt, tubes nested in tubes, each with drainage cocks clearly labelled. Matsuda noted the redundancy. "Even if one line ruptures, the other keeps her breathing," he said. "We build for precision. They build for failure." He spoke not in praise, but in recognition of a civilization that treated imperfection as a natural state. A Navy machinist joined them, sleeves rolled, a cigarette clamped in his teeth. "Our Type 95's carburetors seize after 2 months in this humidity," he said, tapping the Sherman's intake housing. "Look at this gasket rubber, not paper, and the bolts, zinc-plated." He shook his head. "They don't fight rust, they prevent it from being born." Sakurai examined the transmission next a 5-speed synchromesh that glistened like clockwork. Japanese tanks used sliding gears that required delicate timing. This one allowed a driver to slam through ratios with brute confidence. He tried the shifter, felt the detent click, and understood why American armor advanced where others stalled. "Their drivers need no training," he said. "Only fuel." That word fuel hung in the air like a verdict. Logistics. Every revelation about the Sherman pointed to the same invisible giant, the factory and the convoy behind it. Where Japan produced in artisan batches, the Americans produced by calendar rhythm. Even this tank, cobbled from wrecks, carried interchangeable parts as if born from one mold. Sakurai measured bolt threads across 6 assemblies. All identical. "They've turned standardization into a weapon," he said quietly. Matsuda opened an ammunition bin, now empty of shells but rich in insight. Each round had its numbered slot. Springs cushioned the brass from vibration. "Even organization serves the rate of fire." He leafed through the salvaged maintenance log found wedged under the commander's seat. "Oil changes every 50 hours, filters every 100. A checklist for each march." The handwriting American block letters recorded it like liturgy. "Our men fight with spirit," Matsuda said, "but they worship none of this routine, and so the spirit burns out before the engine does." By late afternoon, the engineers gathered for debrief. Charts were drawn on chalkboard panels, lubrication cycles, torque sequences, airflow patterns. A single word appeared again and again in English and in Kana: interchangeability. It was a new creed, and it frightened them more than armor thickness or gun caliber. Sakurai cleaned his hands with a rag and spoke what none wished to say aloud. "We cannot build this," he said simply. "Not the tank, the system that makes it possible." Matsuda looked through the warehouse doors toward the harbor, where oil barges floated like dark coins. "The Americans have made the machine an extension of the supply chain," he said. "Each bolt, a promise that another bolt exists somewhere, waiting to replace it. We build singular things. They build continuity. Outside, a freight train clattered along the siding, hauling drums of fuel toward the naval yard. The rhythm echoed the Sherman's heartbeat, a soundless reminder of industry moving at a scale Japan could no longer match. As the sun fell behind the cranes, the engineers covered the tank again. The tarpaulin settled over the hull like a shroud. Matsuda's final note of the day, written in his precise engineer's script, summarized what no propaganda office would ever print. The enemy's strength lies not in the brilliance of his machines, but in their indifference to failure. Every bolt a twin, every part replaceable, every mistake already forgiven. That night, as the generators dimmed, the men of the Technical Bureau lay awake beneath the hum of the conquered tank's metal. It was not the enemy's armor they feared now, but his method. By the third morning, the sun came up hard and white over Tokyo Bay. Inside warehouse number 6, the smell of machine oil clung to the rafters. The tank stood on timber blocks, stripped of its tracks like a whale half-flensed. What remained looked crude at a glance: stamped steel bogies, thick bolts, oversized springs, but to Major Matsuda Keiji, every bruise on the metal whispered purpose. They began with the bogie trucks. Each was a compact carriage of arms and rollers, 2 volute springs pressed against one another like clenched fists. Lieutenant Sakurai Nobuhiko worked a spanner into the bolts, expecting resistance, but the threads yielded without the shriek of galling metal. The parts came apart not like relics pried from the sea, but like tools that wanted to be handled. 2 men and a jack, and the whole assembly dropped free. No machine shop, no prayer to the gods of friction. Replaceable as a shoe, Sakurai muttered, cradling the truck in both hands. Matsuda crouched beside him. The wheel can die, he said, but the march must live. They laid the components out on burlap. The road wheel hub, when split, revealed twin roller bearings, each sealed in bronze and cushioned by felt. He touched the seals flexible, double-lipped, and realized they were designed to forgive filth. "We designed to keep dirt out," he said. "They designed to live with it." He picked up a coil spring. It was grotesquely heavy, wound from wire thicker than his thumb. He compared it to the slender Japanese Type 97's leaf pack sitting on the bench nearby, compact, tidy, and fragile by comparison. The American spring was an act of defiance against precision itself. It would never break gracefully. It would sag, tire, and keep working. A machinist from Kure, watching with folded arms, spat into a corner. "With this steel, they could build 10 bridges," he said. "But they build one tank that never rests." Sakurai smiled. "Perhaps that is the bridge between one battle and the next." He measured tolerances with a micrometer. The numbers offended every aesthetic instinct in him. Clearances generous, radii large, finishes rough. Yet, when he reassembled the bogie, the rollers turned as smoothly as a lathe spindle. A bit of grease from the captured American tin, still perfumed faintly with graphite and pine, made them gleam. The grease fittings fascinated the younger engineers most. Each truck carried half a dozen, placed so logically that even a sleepy crewman could service them in sequence. Sakurai traced the path of one line with his finger and realized it guided the hand naturally around the wheel. "A maintenance ritual," he said. "It teaches the soldier as he works." Matsuda nodded. "They have built religion into routine." They moved on to the idler mechanism. The adjustment screw was a marvel of deliberate excess, a coarse thread with a heavy pitch that turned easily even when crusted with salt. A single bar through its socket gave a man leverage enough to tighten a whole track. In Japanese service, that same task demanded 3 mechanics, a crowbar, and an oath. When they pulled the return roller cap, Sakurai noticed the tiniest kindness, a raised lip along the edge, just enough for a knife or screwdriver to pry under. "Someone," he said softly, "has lost this cap in the mud, once before." At noon they paused for tea. The floor between them was a map of parts: steel shoes, springs, axles, bearings. Each piece seemed to speak the same language: standardization. On one bogie casting, a small raised C caught the light. Matsuda rubbed it clean with a thumb. "Foundry mark," he said. If it breaks, the factory knows its own child. The thought of such self-awareness in mass production gave him an ache behind the ribs. After lunch, they compared metallurgy. Under the Bureau's portable hardness tester, the American bogey's case depth measured an even 6 millimeters across 3 samples. The Japanese spring pack varied from 2 to 8. Not bad, Matsuda said, but uncertain. Consistency, he realized, was not a luxury. It was the quiet line between reliability and catastrophe. By late afternoon, the engineers performed a test. They rigged a section of track and bogie to a winch, added weights, and cycled it through compression. The vertical volutes bowed, creaked, and returned, again and again. At 100 cycles, the Japanese spring had already begun to whine. At 300, it cracked with a sharp report. The Sherman spring simply shrugged. Its fatigue curve was a straight road that stretched farther than their patience. Sakurai wrote the results in a ledger. Overbuilt, overgreased, forgiving. The enemy builds resilience, not perfection. When twilight fell, Matsuda stood by the stripped hull and spoke quietly to his men. "Our engineers," he said, "love elegance. We make every gram earn its keep. But the Americans let their metal rest. They give their machine space to breathe, room to fail, and time to recover. That is why it keeps moving." A breeze off the bay rattled the tin roof, carrying the faint clang of shipyards still working through rationed nights. Matsuda looked down at the heavy coil in his hands. "This spring," he said, "is the enemy's philosophy made solid. It does not seek perfection. It seeks persistence." He dropped it back onto the bench with a dull, steady thud, the sound of a machine that refused to die. By the 4th day, the engineers had stripped the Sherman nearly to its bones. Only the engine crate remained unopened, a dark wooden sarcophagus stenciled U.S. Army Ordnance, GM 6,046 inches, fading black ink. When the crowbar bit through the nails, a heavy odor of cosmoline filled the room, oil, dust, and the faint sweetness of fuel preserved in metal. What lay inside was less a motor than a statement. Twin General Motors 6 to 71 diesels joined back to back, 12 cylinders total, their crankshafts married through a gear case that looked carved from stubbornness itself. Lieutenant Sakurai ran a cloth along the casting. 2 engines, he said, half to himself. If one dies, the other keeps breathing. Matsuda nodded, redundancy disguised as excess. They make twin hearts because they assume the road will try to kill one. They wheeled the power plant beneath an overhead chain block. The diesels gleamed dull grey beneath layers of preservative. Even without fuel lines or cooling hoses attached, the sense of confidence radiated from its geometry. Fat injectors, clean manifolds, fuel pumps that could be stripped and reassembled with gloves on. The block bore serial numbers struck deep enough to survive a war. One engineer from the Yokosuka arsenal, a veteran of engine failures in Manchuria, peered inside an open cylinder and whistled, cross-hatching still visible, after running in salt water. He looked almost offended. They build with forgiveness. Even corrosion must ask permission. The team began the disassembly. The covers came off in logical sequence, nothing hidden, nothing ornamental. Sakurai noted that the fasteners were identical across both banks, interchangeable even between the port and starboard engines. "A mechanic could strip this blindfolded," he said. "They use sameness as strategy." Matsuda examined the cooling system next. The radiators were massive, their fins thick and evenly spaced. He counted the bolts, each identical, and noticed that every gasket was reusable rubber, not hand-cut paper. The design invited maintenance, not resisted it. "They have assumed a man with dirty hands will be their caretaker," he said, "and they have loved him anyway." By midday, the engineers had the crankcase open. Twin crankshafts turned through a reduction gear, the size of a dinner plate. The gear teeth were polished, the bearings sealed. "It's not beautiful," said Sakurai, "but it is honest." He tapped the crank with a mallet. The sound rang even, no hollowness, no dead notes. Matsuda scribbled in his ledger, balanced like a promise. The more they studied, the clearer the philosophy became. Every fitting was accessible, Oil filters sat at the front where a mechanic could reach them without crawling. Fuel pumps were held by 4 bolts, no hidden studs, no shims. The starter could be replaced in minutes. A soldier, untrained and exhausted, could keep this heart beating in a rainstorm. The Japanese engines they knew, the Type 100 or the Mitsubishi air-cooled radials, were miracles of craftsmanship, but fragile miracles. Their performance depended on artisans, precision, luck. The Sherman's engine depended only on procedure. Late in the afternoon, the team connected a makeshift fuel line and cranked the power plant with an auxiliary motor. The diesels coughed, spat smoke, then caught in a low, confident rumble. The warehouse vibrated. The sound was not sharp like an aircraft radial. It was deep, steady, agricultural, the sound of persistence. Men who had seen machines die from thirst stood silently, listening to one that refused to surrender. Sakurai leaned close to the exhaust. "This sound," he said, "is not warlike. It is industrial." Matsuda smiled without joy. "That's why it wins wars." They throttled it, gently, watched oil pressure climb and hold. Gauges steady, no leaks, no uneven shake. The engine ran like it had never known fear. When they shut it down, the silence seemed almost sacrilegious. The men wiped their hands in silence, the smell of diesel still thick in the air. Matsuda finally spoke. "This is not an engine for warriors," he said. "It is an engine for a nation that manufactures infinity." He wrote the words carefully in his notebook. The Americans do not engineer for excellence, they engineer for endurance. Every moving part serves logistics first and pride last. They build power plants that can be neglected, abused, and still deliver obedience. The machine forgives because its masters can afford to be human. As evening settled over Yokosuka, the men closed the crate again. Through the open doors, they could see ships outlined in sunset, each driven by engines that echoed the same philosophy: repetition, reliability, redemption through overbuild. For a moment, Matsuda imagined an army of such hearts, thousands of them beating in rhythm across oceans, each a twin pulse of steel and fuel. And he understood, with the quiet despair of an engineer outbuilt by an empire, that Japan was losing not to superior courage or tactics, but to the idea that machines could replace failure with inevitability. The Sherman's heart had spoken, and its lesson was merciless. In modern war, perfection dies quickly. Persistence never stops running. The 5th morning brought rain. A thin grey drizzle hissed against the corrugated roof of warehouse number 6, turning the floor into a mirror where rivulets of oil and water mixed into dull rainbows. The Sherman's hull, stripped and skeletal, sat on its blocks like a dissected animal. For the first time, the engineers turned their attention to its skin, the thick, sloped armor that had made it both survivor and teacher. Major Matsuda stood before the glacis plate, running his hand along the angled face. Even, under the dim light, the metal had a muted sheen. 75 millimeters, he said, tapping it with a hammer. The sound came back low and solid. Rolled homogeneous steel, no rivets, no seams, one piece, as if poured by gods. Lieutenant Sakurai, notebook ready, knelt to inspect a jagged scar along the lower plate, a healed wound of war. "This one took a direct hit," he said. "Maybe from a 47 millimeters gun. The round bit in and failed to penetrate." Matsuda nodded. "And yet, it stayed in the fight." He turned to the younger engineers gathered around. "Gentlemen, this is why the Americans can afford boldness. Their armor forgives their bravery." They began by measuring hardness with a portable Brinell tester borrowed from the Kure arsenal. Each reading was astonishingly consistent, no soft spots, no brittle sections. Japanese plate, even the best Type 97 or Type 3 armor, varied from cast to cast. The Americans had achieved something far more elusive than strength: uniformity. Sakurai recorded the numbers, his pencil shaking slightly. "The tolerance spread is less than 1%, he said. "How can they control so many furnaces?" "By making the furnace serve the measurement," Matsuda replied. "We rely on craftsmen, they rely on instruments." They moved next to the weld's broad seams that looked crude but perfect. Each bead followed a rhythm, as though laid by a mechanical hand. Matsuda pointed out the clean undercuts, the absence of slag. "We weld for beauty," he said. "They weld for eternity." The Japanese engineers had prided themselves on cast armor complex curves shaped like sculpture, but the Sherman's rolled plates, joined by deliberate simplicity, told a different story. The geometry of its hull was not aesthetic but arithmetic, each angle calculated to deflect, each weld line placed for production speed. "They don't hide the structure," Sakurai said. "They expose it." "Yes," Matsuda answered, tracing a finger along the weld seam, "because they have nothing to hide." By noon, the rain eased, and the team turned to the turret. It was cast in one piece, rough as pumice on the outside but precisely machined where it mattered. The armor mantlet, heavy and smooth, turned with a gentle shove despite months of corrosion. When they removed the gun mount, the engineers found a hydraulic recoil system compact enough to be maintained by one man. "Everything serves accessibility," Sakurai observed. "Even the armor's shape follows maintenance," Matsuda agreed. "The Americans design not for the craftsman, but for the soldier who has no time to think. The machine is the teacher. The manual is built into the metal." He lifted a small stamped plate from the turret ring, an instruction tag in English. "Grease every 100 hours, ordnance depth. Spec. 175. The letters were crisp, legible after years in salt. "Even their reminders endure," Matsuda murmured. After lunch, the metallurgists began cutting small samples from a damaged section of hull. The torch hissed, sending sparks over the wet floor. When the fragments cooled, they examined the grain under a magnifier. The texture was even, the crystal size controlled. They had expected impurities, manganese, perhaps, or phosphorus, but the sample showed none worth noting. Sakurai leaned back, frustrated and reverent all at once. "How do they make so much steel this clean?" "Because they melt by the thousands of tons," Matsuda said softly. "Impurities average out in scale. Abundance is purity." That sentence lingered like incense. The men realized that what they faced was not just engineering, it was civilization expressed in alloy. America's wealth allowed consistency. Its factories, its ore trains, its ship convoys, all parts of a single nervous system that produced reliability as naturally as breath. A young ensign from the Naval Construction Corps, silent until then, spoke up. "Our designs are clever," he said, "but each depends on the man who builds it. This depends on no one man." Matsuda smiled faintly. "Which means it depends on everyone." Toward evening, the engineers conducted a final demonstration. Using hydraulic jacks, they raised the hull slightly and struck it with a 47mm test shell head not fired, but driven manually with force. The shell dented the plate and stopped cold. A clean crater, no cracks. "Toughness," Matsuda said, "not hardness. They have balanced both." The men stared at the crater's edge. The metal had flexed, not shattered. It was steel that behaved like memory. When the test was done, Matsuda walked the perimeter of the hull, trailing his hand along the rain-slick armor. "They do not worship metal," he said quietly. "They teach it obedience." Sakurai closed his notebook. "We cannot match this by willpower, only by method." "Exactly," Matsuda replied. "The Sherman is not just a machine, it is a process in motion. Each plate, each weld, is evidence of 1,000 invisible hands guided by a single idea, that no man should be irreplaceable." Outside, thunder rolled over the bay, echoing faintly through the hangars. Matsuda paused by the open door, watching the grey sea beyond. "We believed the war would be won by courage," he said, almost to himself. "But courage dies when the fuel runs out. This tank proves that endurance is the only virtue that matters." He looked back at the half-dismantled Sherman scored, stripped, but still proud even in silence. "Their armor protects more than men," he added. "It protects a philosophy, that strength should be common." As the rain returned, the engineers covered the tank once more. The canvas settled heavily, whispering over the welded seams. In the dim light, The hull looked less like an enemy relic and more like an artifact from a future they would never reach. Matsuda wrote his last note of the day, the ink bleeding slightly from humidity. Armor is only as strong as the society that casts it. We forge our steel to endure battle, they forge theirs to endure time. The warehouse went dark. Only the sound of rain on steel remained soft, steady, and relentless, like the heartbeat of the machine that refused to die. By the 6th day, the air in the warehouse smelled of solvent and damp paper. The engineers had opened every hatch, traced every wire, and drained every reservoir of the captured Sherman. What remained was not mystery but revelation, an entire philosophy of war rendered in grease and gasket. Major Matsuda Keiji gathered his notes into a rough pile on the table pages covered with sketches of fittings, bolt sizes, and flow diagrams. The numbers were simple, even childlike. That was what unsettled him most. "They hide genius behind arithmetic," he murmured. Lieutenant Sakurai Nobuhiko was kneeling beside the gearbox, cleaning out its last traces of oil. The American transmission fascinated him more than any armor or engine. 6 forward speeds, all synchronized. The clutch pedal moved easily underfoot. The linkage was balanced. "It feels like operating a sewing machine," he said. "No violence, no struggle." Matsuda joined him. "They have made control gentle," he said. "That is power in itself." He pointed to the governor assembly, a small, spring-loaded device that regulated fuel flow automatically. It was simple, almost crude, but reliable. "You see, Nobuhiko? They design for men who will forget. This tank forgives." Sakurai smiled wryly. "Ours punishes." The transmission was drained, disassembled, and laid out piece by piece on linen. The gears were beveled and uniform, their teeth rounded slightly to prevent binding. Each bore a number, and every number matched the manual printed in 1942. The engineers had found a copy inside the tank's stowage, wrapped in oiled canvas. A Japanese machinist turned the book over in his hands, astonished. "Every step illustrated," he said, "even the errors they anticipate." "That is how they train armies of mechanics," Matsuda replied. "Not by apprenticeship, but by replication." He gestured toward a set of crates labeled "Spare Parts," M4A1 medium tank. Inside were smaller wooden boxes, each compartmentalized, each part numbered to match an index. Bolts of 5 different lengths, yet every one shared the same thread pitch, bearings that fit interchangeably into 3 different housings. It was not elegance, it was unity. The Japanese engineers were used to improvisation, hand-fitting, filing, and adjusting each component until it felt right. But the Americans had removed the craftsman's ego from the process entirely. The machine didn't care who built it, only that the measurements were followed. "Standardization," Sakurai said, almost whispering the foreign word as if invoking a spell. "We build as artisans, they build as a nation." Matsuda's eyes narrowed. "And that is why their machines live longer than their builders." They moved next to the lubrication system. Oil lines snaked through the hull like veins, connecting bearings, shafts, and pumps. Every joint used the same coupling type, universal, repeatable. The Americans had even stamped directional arrows into the metal, so no soldier could mistake flow direction. A corporal traced one arrow with his finger. "It speaks to you," he said. "Exactly," replied Matsuda. "Their machines instruct the ignorant. Ours demand obedience from the skilled." At midday, they brought in a captured U.S. Army maintenance film celluloid reels taken from a downed transport. The projector flickered against the concrete wall, showing young American soldiers smiling as they greased tank fittings and replaced filters. The narration was calm, paternal. Preventive maintenance saves lives. Sakurai watched in silence. The voice spoke of scheduled checks, lubrication intervals, and component swaps, all organized by time, not failure. "They plan for the future of every bolt," he said. Matsuda nodded slowly. "They build permanence into routine. It's not just engineering, it's culture." After lunch, they tested the cooling system by filling it with fresh water and sealing the lines. The pump engaged with a soft hum. Even after months of neglect, the impeller spun freely. No leaks, no sputters. Matsuda smiled thinly. Even abandoned, it obeys. He looked around the warehouse, the stripped engine, the orderly parts, the crates marked in neat black lettering. "This tank does not win battles," he said. "It prevents defeats. Every component exists to keep the next from failing." That afternoon, a visiting naval captain arrived from Tokyo to inspect their findings. He was a proud man, once an engineer on the Yamato. He listened to Matsuda's report without interruption, his expression unreadable. When the major finished, the captain said, "So, you mean to tell me the Americans have no superior design, only superior process?" Matsuda met his gaze. "Process is design," he said. "The machine reflects the mind that built it, and their mind is patient." The captain frowned. "Patience does not win wars." "No," Matsuda said softly, "but it ends them." The officers dismissed the team for the evening, yet no one left. The engineers lingered around the Sherman, touching its steel skin as though it might answer their unspoken questions. Sakurai broke the silence. "Sir," he said, "if they build every tank this way, how do we defeat them?" Matsuda took a long time before replying. "We don't. We endure as long as our parts last, and they will last less." He turned toward the open bay doors. Outside, the rain had ceased. A faint orange sunset bled across the harbour, where the silhouettes of half-finished ships stood like exhausted sentinels. "This tank was not built by Grafe, warriors," he continued, "but by bookkeepers, machinists, and farmers who trust their system more than any one man's skill. That faith is their strength." He set his hand on the Sherman's hull, the metal still cool and damp. "Do you know why it never breaks down, Nobuhiko? Because it's built stronger? No," Matsuda said. "Because it's built simpler, because every soldier who touches it knows that if he follows the instructions, it will forgive him." He paused. "We build to impress our superiors. They build to empower their inferiors." The room fell quiet again. Somewhere outside, a diesel generator coughed to life, a distant, stubborn heartbeat. As the lights dimmed, Matsuda gathered his papers into a folder marked "Confidential Sherman Examination Report." His final entry read, "The enemy's machines are not stronger because of material. They are stronger because of faith in replication. Every bolt is a promise kept. Their power lies not in invention, but in discipline." He closed the folder, his fingers lingering on the rough paper. The lessons of oil and order were bitter, but undeniable. When the doors finally shut and the warehouse went dark, the captured Sherman sat in silence, its drained systems at rest, yet its meaning alive in every man who had studied it. They had dismantled the machine, but the philosophy inside it would haunt them long after the war ended. That reliability, once made systemic, becomes invincible. By the 7th morning, the engineers had done everything they could. The Sherman lay in quiet disassembly, an anatomy lesson in steel and humility. The rain had stopped, but Yokosuka was still wrapped in mist. Somewhere in the distance, naval guns from the proving ground thudded like slow heartbeats. Inside the warehouse, the men stood among the tank's scattered remains, as if in a shrine. Major Matsuda Keiji, pale from exhaustion and sleepless nights, gathered his men around the stripped pla's hull. Crates of labelled parts surrounded them: bogies, bearings, gear sets, gaskets, each tagged, catalogued, understood. "Gentlemen," he said softly, "we have reached the end. What remains is comprehension." Lieutenant Sakurai Nobuhiko stepped forward with the final inspection report, the paper edges curled from humidity. "We've documented 762 individual components," he said. "Of them, 540 are standardized across the entire tank, identical bolts, threads, fittings. No specialization, no artistry, just uniformity." A silence settled. Then Matsuda asked quietly, "And how many can we reproduce?" Sakurai hesitated. "Perhaps 50, maybe less. Our machines lack the precision, and our factories the material." Matsuda smiled bitterly. then there is our true defeat. He walked to the engine block, now resting on its wooden cradle. The grey metal gleamed faintly beneath a thin sheen of oil. "We thought this war was a contest of courage," he said. "It is not. It is a contest of repetition." One of the younger engineers, barely 20, asked, "Sir, how can repetition win a war?" "Because repetition becomes certainty," Matsuda replied, "and certainty wins campaigns before they begin." He gestured toward the Sherman's turret ring. "This tank is not clever. It is inevitable." By midday, the Army Technical Bureau's director arrived from Tokyo, Colonel Aizawa, a stern bureaucrat with ink-stained fingers and little patience for poetry. He demanded to see the captured tank's remains. Matsuda led him through the rows of components, explaining as they went. The forgiving tolerances, the overbuilt springs, the standard fittings. Aizawa listened without expression until Matsuda showed him the maintenance manual, its diagrams neat and cartoonish. "A tank designed for a farmer," Matsuda said. The colonel frowned. "And yet it crushed our divisions at Saipan." "Because the farmer could fix it," Matsuda said, simply. Aizawa's lips tightened. "You admire them too much, Major." "I fear them, sir," Matsuda replied. "Admiration is merely honesty in uniform." The colonel folded his hands behind his back, studying the tank's hull. "You believe this? This simplicity explains their success?" "It explains their endurance," Matsuda said, "and endurance is the skeleton of victory." Aizawa walked the length of the warehouse in silence. The engineers stood at attention, their faces taut. Finally, the colonel turned. "Then what would you have us do?" "Unlearn pride," Matsuda said quietly, "and begin again." The colonel said nothing more. He left the warehouse with his aides, boots echoing like verdicts on the wet floor. That evening, as the sky dimmed to ash, Sakurai sat on a crate beside the stripped hull. He had been writing all day measurements, diagrams, notes, but none of it felt adequate. How could a few pages capture what the machine had revealed? Matsuda joined him, holding a mug of tea gone cold. For a long time neither spoke. Finally, Sakurai said, "When I first saw this tank, I expected arrogance, a machine that shouted its power, but it whispers. It only wants to work." Matsuda nodded. "That is the secret. The Americans build things that serve their users, not their makers. The man and the machine share humility." He paused, listening to the faint creak of metal as the tank cooled in the evening air. "Our machines demand reverence," he said. "Theirs demand attention. That is why they outlast us." Sakurai looked down at the Sherman's worn tread plate, where English letters still showed through the grime. "Danger stand clear of tracks." The warning seemed absurdly polite. "Even their warnings are instructions for survival," he said. "Yes," Matsuda murmured, "because they assume the soldier is worth saving." 2 days later, the Sherman's components were packed into wooden crates for shipment to Tokyo. The engineers supervised in silence, each bolt and bearing wrapped in oiled paper. They knew most of the material would be melted down or hidden from Allied bombing raids soon enough, but the lessons would remain, carried in notebooks and memories. When the last crate was sealed, Matsuda took one final walk around the empty hull. He placed his hand on the glacis plate, still pitted with old scars. "This tank never asked to be admired," he said softly, "only to continue." Sakurai stood beside him. "It will not continue for us." "No," Matsuda said, "but what it taught us might." He turned toward his men. "Remember this. It is not the strength of steel that wins, but the strength of system. Every bolt, every spring, every habit, it all connects. When we lose, it will not be for lack of bravery. It will be because our machines cannot forgive our mistakes." The men saluted silently. In the months that followed, fragments of the Sherman report circulated quietly among military bureaus. Some dismissed it as defeatist, others called it prophetic. By the time the war ended in fire and surrender, the document had already become a ghost, an artifact of engineers who had seen the future too clearly. Years later, in 1952, an American occupation officer visited the reborn Yokosuka arsenal. Among the surviving records, he found a thin folder labeled Report No. 47, Captured M4 Medium Tank, 1944. The handwriting was neat, the tone reverent. At the end, beneath Matsuda's signature, was a single line written in Japanese and English: "Reliability is the truest weapon." The officer showed it to a colleague and said, "They understood more than we thought." That same year, in a Tokyo factory rebuilding Japan's first post-war trucks, a young engineer named Sakurai, older now, his hair touched with grey, stood before an assembly line of engines. The parts were uniform, the workers methodical. For the first time, the process reminded him of that long winter in Yokosuka, of the captured Sherman that had taught him the mathematics of endurance. When a worker asked why every bolt was numbered the same, Sakurai smiled, "Because one day, someone will thank you for not being special." He glanced out the window toward the bay, where ships moved like quiet machinery against the horizon, and he realized that the lesson had endured after all. Machines that forgive survive longer than nations that demand perfection. The Sherman's ghost lived on in steel, in factories, in the quiet logic of standard bolts and labeled grease points. It had not only survived, it had taught. The war had ended, the machine had not. Spring 1945 brought Yokosuka to ruin. The once busy harbour lay littered with burned ships and half-sunk cranes. The air still tasted of smoke, and the warehouses that had once held secrets now stood hollow and broken. In one corner of the Navy technical arsenal, half buried under debris, the rusting hull of the captured Sherman still lingered. The war was nearly over. The lessons it carried had only begun to unfold. Major Matsuda Keiji did not live to see Japan's surrender. He was killed that July when American carrier planes struck the arsenal complex. His men buried him behind the workshop, marking the grave with a welding torch handle for a headstone. When the Americans came ashore weeks later, they found the disassembled Sherman among the wreckage, its components still tagged, its steel still whole. One of the occupation engineers, Captain Raymond H. Crosby of the U.S. Ordnance Corps, examined the crates and remarked quietly, "They were studying her. They were trying to understand why she kept moving." The Americans cleared the wreckage carefully. Nothing was left to chance. But as the occupation deepened, something unexpected happened. A few of the surviving Japanese engineers, men like Lieutenant Sakurai, were quietly retained as technical advisors. Their knowledge of materials and repair techniques was invaluable to the reconstruction effort, and among them, those who had studied the Sherman carried an almost sacred memory, a belief that engineering could be both humble and indestructible. By 1948, Japan's surviving industry had begun to stir again. Small factories reopened under the supervision of the Supreme Commander for the Allied powers. Many of them, stripped of their military contracts, turned to civilian production farm tools, motorcycles, and eventually automobiles. Former officers became designers and technicians. Among them was Sakurai, now a thin, soft-spoken man working for a fledgling automotive cooperative in Yokohama. Every morning he arrived early, carrying the same leather-bound notebook he had used in 1944. Inside were sketches of American fittings, cross-sections of oil pumps, and his translation of Matsuda's final report. His young apprentices, men who had never seen war, would often laugh at his insistence on uniform parts and redundant systems. "Sensei," they would ask, "why do we make every bolt the same? It's boring." Sakurai would smile. "Because boredom is reliability," he said, "and reliability is victory, even in peace." He had learned that lesson in the echo of a dying empire. In 1950, when Japan's rearmament quietly began under the new self-defense force, American advisors visited Japanese factories to gauge their capacity. Colonel Crosby, now older, balding, and still haunted by the ruins of Yokosuka, recognized one name on a list of local consultants: Sakurai Nobuhiko. He arranged a meeting. They met at a small steelworks outside Tokyo. The two men, once enemies, shook hands beneath the metallic clatter of lathes. Sakurai spoke in halting English. Crosby answered in careful Japanese. They talked not of war but of machines, how to prevent breakdowns, how to build for endurance. When Crosby asked if Sakurai remembered the captured Sherman, the Japanese engineer's face softened. "Yes," Sakurai said. "It taught me more than any teacher. It showed me that a nation's strength is in how it maintains what it builds." Crosby nodded. "And now you teach others to do the same." Sakurai smiled faintly. "Because we lost, I must teach how not to lose again." That same year, at the U.S.-Japanese Technical Symposium in Yokohama, Sakurai presented a paper titled Standardization and the Future of Mechanical Reliability. The audience, mostly young engineers born too late to remember the war, listened politely as he described lubrication intervals, part numbering, and tolerances. Only near the end did he speak of the Sherman, though not by name. "I once studied a machine that came to us in war," he said. "It was built not for brilliance but for forgiveness. Its strength was not in armor or fire, but in order and invisible discipline that let any man repair it. That machine changed my country, though we did not know it then." He paused, then added, "The greatest invention of the modern age is not the tank or the airplane. It is the spare part." When he finished, there was silence. Then, unexpectedly, applause. Years later, as Japan's economy surged, factories across the nation embraced the very principles Sakurai had once copied from the Sherman's design: modularity, interchangeability, preventive maintenance, production by measurement rather than by feel. The methods that had built an invincible tank became the foundation of a peaceful industrial empire. In 1962, at a joint U.S.-Japanese symposium on wartime technology in Honolulu, a surviving American officer from the 4th Marine Division brought an old photograph. It showed Japanese engineers in 1944 standing beside the captured Sherman, notebooks in hand. When he passed it around the table, Sakurai, now grey-haired and dignified, studied the image for a long time. "They called it the tank that never broke down," the American said. "Did it help you in the end?" Sakurai folded the photograph gently. "It helped us understand why we did." When he died in 1978, his students placed a small brass plaque at his grave. It bore no rank, no title, only the words he had repeated all his life: "Endurance is design." And in a museum in Dayton, Ohio, the same model of tank, the M4 Sherman, stood gleaming under lights. Visitors walked past its thick armor and long gun barrel, reading about battles and victories. Few noticed the small display nearby, containing Japanese sketches of an engine cross-section labeled in 2 languages. "Oil flows smooth as memory." It was all that remained of the study begun in Yokosuka, the quiet dialogue between enemies who had both learned the same truth, that perfection was never the goal, only persistence, only motion. The war had ended long ago, but the hum of the machine, the logic of its order, still echoed steady, patient, eternal.